The autumn rain fell mercilessly on the streets of Gangnam, each droplet carrying with it the weight of 1,000 broken promises. Min Junho stood beneath the flickering streetlight, his designer coat soaked through, yet he remained motionless. In his trembling hand, he clutched a crumpled newspaper clipping, the announcement that would shatter everything he believed about love, about trust, about the woman who had stolen his heart only to break it into 1,000,000 irreparable pieces. Lee So-jin, heiress to the Hansung Group fortune, announces engagement to Park Hyun-woo, CEO of Daewon Industries. He read aloud, his voice barely audible above the sound of rain hitting the pavement. The words felt like poison on his tongue, each syllable a reminder of how thoroughly he had been deceived. 2 years. 2 years of believing that Sojin was just another struggling university student working part-time jobs to make ends meet. 2 years of sharing instant ramen in his tiny one-room apartment, of walking home together because she claimed she couldn't afford bus fare, of him working overtime at the construction site just to take her out for a decent meal on special occasions. 2 years of falling deeper in love with what he thought was her beautiful, humble soul. But it had all been a lie, an elaborate, cruel game played by a bored Chibo princess who found entertainment in the genuine affections of a man she considered beneath her social status. June Ho's phone buzzed. A text message from his younger sister, Minji. "Oppa, I saw the news. Are you okay? Please call me back." He didn't respond. How could he explain that the woman he had planned to propose to, the woman for whom he had saved every penny for 6 months to buy a modest but heartfelt engagement ring, was actually one of the richest women in Seoul? How could he admit that while he was worrying about her eating properly, she was probably dining at Michelin-starred restaurants with her real friends, laughing about the poor construction worker who actually believed her act? The memory hit him like a physical blow. Last month, when Sojin had called him crying, claiming she couldn't afford her mother's medical treatment, he had emptied his savings account without hesitation, borrowing additional money from loan sharks he couldn't afford to owe. 15 million won, everything he had worked for since graduation, handed over to help the woman he loved in her time of need. "My mother is everything to me, Junho." She had sobbed into his shoulder that night. "Without this surgery, she might not make it. I don't know what I'll do." He had held her close, stroking her hair, promising that everything would be all right. "We'll get through this together," he had whispered. That's what people who love each other do. What people who love each other do. The irony was so bitter he could taste it. Junho finally moved, his feet carrying him through the familiar streets of his neighborhood, a stark contrast to the glittering towers of Gangnam, where Jin's family probably lived. He climbed the narrow stairs to his rooftop apartment, each step feeling heavier than the last. The tiny space that had once felt cozy now seemed suffocatingly small. This was where she had pretended to feel at home. This was where she had looked around with what he now realized was probably disgust masked as admiration. "It's so warm and lived in," she had said on her first visit, her fingers trailing along his second-hand furniture. "It feels more like a home than anywhere I've ever been." Another lie. Another performance in her elaborate charade. He sat on his bed, the same bed where they had held each other through countless nights, where she had whispered words of love that now felt like daggers in his chest. The engagement ring he had bought for her sat in a small velvet box on his nightstand, a constant reminder of his foolishness. 3 months' salary for a ring that would never grace her finger, because her real fiancé could probably buy her diamonds worth more than Junho would earn in his entire lifetime. His phone rang. So Jin's name flashed on the screen, accompanied by the photo of her laughing face that had once brought him such joy. He stared at it, his thumb hovering over the decline button. But something stopped him. Maybe it was masochism, or maybe it was the need to hear her voice one last time before he said goodbye to the woman who had never really existed. Junho? Her voice was exactly as he remembered, soft, sweet, with that slight tremor that had always made him want to protect her. Even now, knowing what he knew, his heart betrayed him by skipping a beat. "I saw the news," he said simply, his voice emotionless. There was a long pause. When she spoke again, her voice was different, smaller, more careful. Junho, I can explain. Can you? He laughed, but there was no humor in it. Can you explain how you're both a struggling student working part-time jobs and the heiress to a multi-billion-won corporation? Can you explain how your mother was dying in a hospital bed while simultaneously sitting on the board of directors of 3 major companies? Can you explain any of it, Sojin? Or should I call you Lee Sojin C now? Would that be more appropriate? Please, just let me. No, he cut her off, surprised by the steadiness of his own voice. I don't want to hear any more lies. I've heard enough lies to last me a lifetime. It wasn't all lies, she whispered, and he could hear tears in her voice. My feelings for you, they were real. They are real. Your feelings? Junho stood up, pacing the small confines of his apartment. What feelings? Love? Do you even know what that word means? Love is trust, Sojin. Love is honesty. Love is caring more about the other person's well-being than your own comfort. You don't know anything about love. I do love you, she said, her voice breaking. I know I made mistakes. I know I should have told you the truth, but I was scared. I was scared you would treat me differently. If you knew. Treat you differently? Junho's voice rose, months of pent-up emotion finally breaking free. You mean, treat you with the respect you actually deserve, instead of the pity you manipulated me into feeling? You mean not working myself to exhaustion trying to provide for someone who could buy and sell everything I own with her pocket change? That's not. I never wanted your pity. I wanted your love. My love? He laughed again, this time with genuine incredulity. You had my love. You had all of it. Every piece of my heart, every thought in my head, every plan for my future. It all included you. But you threw it away for what? For fun? For the thrill of slumming it with the poor boy? It wasn't like that, she protested, but her voice lacked conviction. Then what was it like? Explain it to me. Because I'm trying to understand how someone could look at another person's genuine feelings and decide to use them as entertainment. The silence stretched between them, filled only by the sound of rain against his window and the distant hum of traffic. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely a whisper. I was engaged to Hyun-woo when I met you. It was arranged by our families when we were children. I never had a choice in anything. Not my education, not my career, not my life. When I started university, it was the first time I could just be normal, anonymous. When I met you, you saw me as just another student, just another girl. You didn't see my family name or my bank account. You saw me, but I didn't see you, Junho said quietly. I saw who you pretended to be. The real you is someone who could lie to the person she claims to love for 2 years. The real you is someone who could take money from a man who works with his hands while sitting on a fortune that could feed 1,000 families. The real you is someone I never knew at all. I wanted to tell you, she said, desperation creeping into her voice. So many times I almost did, but I was terrified of losing you. Terrified that you would hate me or think I was just another spoiled rich girl playing games. Weren't you? The question hung in the air like a sword waiting to fall. Another long pause. Maybe at first, but not after I got to know you. Not after I fell in love with you. You fell in love with the idea of being someone else, Junho said, his voice heavy with exhaustion. You fell in love with the fantasy of being the kind of person who could love someone like me. But when it came time to choose, really choose, between your real life and your pretend one, you chose your real life. You chose your family's money, and your arranged marriage, and your comfortable, predictable future. I didn't have a choice, she whispered. My family would never. There's always a choice, he interrupted. You just didn't love me enough to make the hard one. The silence that followed felt final. Junho could hear her crying on the other end of the line, and despite everything, part of him still wanted to comfort her. But that part was growing smaller, being slowly consumed by something darker and more powerful, a cold, burning need for justice. I'm sorry, she said finally. I'm so sorry, Junho. I never meant for any of this to happen. I know, he said, and meant it. I know you never meant for me to find out. That's not what I meant. Goodbye, Sojin. He ended the call, before she could say anything else. Junho set his phone aside and walked to his small window, looking out at the city lights blurred by rain. Somewhere out there, in a penthouse apartment or a mansion in the hills, Sojin was probably crying. Maybe she even meant it. Maybe some part of her really had loved him. In whatever way someone like her was capable of love. But it didn't matter anymore. Love built on lies wasn't love at all. It was just another kind of theft. She had stolen 2 years of his life, his savings, his trust, his dreams of a future together. She had stolen his ability to believe in love itself. And theft, Junho knew, demanded restitution. He opened his laptop and began to research. Lee Sojin, daughter of Lee Dong-suk, chairman of Hansung Group. Hansung Group, one of the largest conglomerates in South Korea, with interests in construction, electronics, and pharmaceuticals. The company that had built half of Seoul, including the very apartment complex where Junho lived. He spent the next several hours reading everything he could find about the Lee family, about Hansung Group, about the intricate web of business relationships and political connections that kept the Chibal families in power. He learned about their charitable foundations that claimed to help the poor, while their business practices kept wages low. He learned about their tax avoidance schemes and their history of corruption scandals that somehow never resulted in real consequences. He learned about the engagement announcement itself, how it was being positioned as a merger between two powerful families, a strategic alliance that would create one of the largest business empires in Asia. Sojin wasn't just marrying Park Hyun-woo. She was becoming a chess piece in a game played by titans of industry. But chess pieces, Junho realized, could be moved by anyone who understood the board. As dawn broke over Seoul, Junho closed his laptop and made himself a cup of instant coffee. The same brand he and Sojin used to share when she was pretending that instant coffee was all she could afford. He sat at his small table, sipping the bitter liquid, and began to plan. Revenge, he had always thought, was a luxury that poor people couldn't afford. The rich had lawyers and connections, and the ability to destroy someone's life with a phone call. The poor had to swallow their pride, accept their losses, and move on. But Junho was beginning to understand that his poverty might actually be an advantage. He had nothing left to lose, which meant he could take risks that someone with a reputation to protect never could. The first phase would be information gathering. He needed to understand exactly how Hansung Group operated, what their vulnerabilities were, where their skeletons were buried. And he needed to do it without anyone suspecting that Min Junho, humble construction worker, had any interest in bringing down one of South Korea's most powerful families. The second phase would be infiltration. He couldn't attack Hansung Group from the outside. He didn't have the resources or the connections, but he could get close enough to do real damage from within. He just needed to figure out how. The third phase would be the reckoning itself. He would make Sojin understand what it felt like to lose everything you cared about. He would make her family pay for raising a daughter who thought other people's hearts were toys to be played with and discarded. He would make them all remember the name Min Junho, not as the poor boy who wasn't good enough for their princess, but as the man who brought their empire crashing down. It would take time, months, maybe years. He would have to be patient, careful, methodical. He would have to become someone else, just as Sojin had become someone else when she was with him. The irony wasn't lost on him. Junho finished his coffee and got ready for work. At the construction site, he would listen more carefully to the conversations around him. Construction workers built the infrastructure that kept the city running. They saw things, heard things, had access to places that others didn't. They were invisible to the wealthy people who benefited from their labor, which made them perfect spies. He would also start taking evening classes, business, accounting, maybe even law. He needed to understand how the system worked if he was going to use it against those who had created it. He would tell his co-workers and his sister that he was trying to better himself, trying to build a future. It wouldn't even be a lie exactly. He was building a future, just not the kind anyone would expect. The rain had stopped by the time Junho left his apartment. The morning air was crisp and clean, washed free of yesterday's pollution. As he walked to the bus stop, he passed a newsstand where Jin's engagement photo smiled at him from the front page of several society magazines. She looked beautiful, elegant, every inch the Chaebol heiress in her designer dress and perfect makeup. Nothing like the girl who had sat on his bed in oversized sweaters, eating convenience store ramen, and complaining about how expensive everything was. He bought one of the magazines and tucked it into his work bag. He would need to study her world, learn its rules and its players. Know your enemy, his grandfather had always said. Know them better than they know themselves. At the construction site, Junho worked with a new focus. Every building they were erecting, every foundation they were laying, was connected to the larger ecosystem of Seoul's development. Hansung Group had fingers in dozens of construction projects across the city. They were building hospitals and schools and office towers, all while exploiting the workers who made their vision reality. During his lunch break, Junho struck up a conversation with Park Sang-ho, an older worker who had been in construction for over 20 years. Sang-ho had worked on projects for every major company in Seoul, including several Hansung developments. You know what I hate most about these Chaebol companies? Sang-ho said, unwrapping his homemade kimbap. They cut corners everywhere they can, use the cheapest materials, pay us the minimum they can get away with, and then they act like they're doing us some kind of favor by giving us jobs. Have you ever worked directly for Hansung? Junho asked casually. A few times. They're some of the worst, actually. Always behind on payments, always trying to renegotiate contracts after the work is already done. And their safety standards. Sang-ho shook his head. I've seen things that would make your hair curl. But what are you going to do? Report them? They own half the government. What kind of things? Junho pressed. Sang-ho looked around nervously, then leaned closer. Promise me this doesn't leave this table. Junho nodded. 3 years ago, I was working on a Hansung apartment complex in Mapogu. Luxury units, selling for billions of won each. But the foundation work was shoddy. I'm talking about serious structural problems that could lead to collapse down the line. I tried to report it to the site supervisor, but he told me to keep my mouth shut if I wanted to keep my job. What happened? Nothing. The building got finished, got sold, got occupied. As far as I know, those families are still living there, completely unaware that their expensive homes are basically death traps waiting to happen. Junho filed this information away carefully. Structural problems in luxury buildings could be a scandal that would cost Hansung Group millions in lawsuits and reconstruction costs. But he would need proof, documentation, something more than the word of a construction worker against a corporation with unlimited legal resources. Do you remember which building it was? The exact address? Sang-ho gave him a suspicious look. Why do you want to know? Junho shrugged, trying to appear casual. Just curious. I drive past a lot of these luxury complexes on my way home, and I always wonder what it would be like to live in one of them. Uedo Heights, Sang-ho said after a moment. Tower B specifically. But like I said, this conversation never happened. That evening, Junho took a detour on his way home to drive past Uedo Heights. It was exactly what he had expected. A gleaming tower of glass and steel, with a doorman in a crisp uniform and luxury cars parked in the underground garage. The kind of place where Sojin probably felt at home, where people like Junho were invisible except when they were needed to fix something or deliver something. He parked across the street and observed the building for over an hour, noting the security cameras, the entry points, the patterns of people coming and going. He wasn't planning to break in, that would be stupid and dangerous. But he was learning to think like someone who might need to gather evidence, someone who understood that information was power. Over the following weeks, Junho fell into a new routine. He worked his construction job during the day, listening carefully to conversations and building relationships with workers who had experience with Hansung projects. In the evenings, he attended business classes at a community college, telling anyone who asked that he was trying to start his own small construction company someday. He also began following Sojin's social media accounts, not out of lingering affection but as part of his research. Her Instagram was a carefully curated collection of photos that painted the picture of a sophisticated young heiress living her best life. Museum visits, Charity galas, expensive restaurants, vacation photos from exotic locations. There was no trace of the girl who had claimed to survive on part-time job wages and instant ramen. But Junho was learning to read between the lines. In several photos, he could see the strain around her eyes, the forced quality of her smiles. In one post from a family dinner, she looked genuinely miserable despite the caption about being blessed to celebrate with loved ones. Her engagement to Park Hyun-woo was featured prominently, but the photos of them together felt stilted and formal, more like business partners than lovers. Good, Junho thought. Let her be miserable. Let her understand what it felt like to be trapped in a life built on lies. 3 months after the engagement announcement, Junho got his first real break. One of his classmates in his accounting course mentioned that her sister worked as a secretary at a law firm that handled corporate accounts. During a casual conversation about the challenges of working for demanding clients, she mentioned that Hansung Group was notorious for last-minute document requests and unrealistic deadlines. My sister says they're constantly dealing with some kind of crisis, the classmate said. Regulatory investigations, shareholder disputes, contract negotiations gone wrong. She jokes that working for Hansung clients is like having a second full-time job. Junho filed this information away and began to research which law firm employed the classmate's sister. A little internet detective work revealed that it was Kim & Associates, one of Seoul's most prestigious corporate law firms. More importantly, they were currently hiring paralegals and document assistants for their corporate division. The position required evening and weekend work, perfect for someone who already had a day job. The pay was decent, and the work involved organizing and digitizing legal documents, which would give Junho access to exactly the kind of information he needed to understand Hansung's vulnerabilities. He applied for the job using his real qualifications, his business coursework, his attention to detail, his ability to work independently. He didn't mention his connection to Sojin or his interest in Hansung Group specifically. As far as his potential employers knew, he was just a hard-working guy trying to build a better future for himself. The interview went well. Junho had learned to present himself professionally, to speak confidently about his goals and his work ethic. The hiring manager, a tired-looking woman in her 40s, seemed impressed by his willingness to work nights and weekends. The corporate division is very demanding, she warned him. Our clients expect perfection, and they expect it quickly. Are you prepared for that kind of pressure? I've been working construction for 5 years, Junho replied. I understand what it means to deliver quality work under tight deadlines. 2 weeks later, he was hired. His first day at Kim & Associates was a revelation. The law firm occupied 3 floors of a glass tower in Yonggu, with floor-to-ceiling windows that offered spectacular views of the Han River. The offices were decorated with expensive art and furniture that probably cost more than Junho made in a year. This was the world where deals worth billions of won were negotiated over coffee and handshakes. His job was relatively straightforward but critically important. Legal documents needed to be scanned, organized, and stored in digital databases that lawyers could search quickly when preparing cases or responding to client requests. The work required attention to detail and absolute confidentiality. A single misfiled document or data breach could cost the firm millions in liability. Junho was assigned to work primarily on Hansung Group files, which was either incredible luck or destiny depending on how you looked at it. Within his first week, he had access to contracts, correspondence, financial records, and legal memos that painted a comprehensive picture of how the company operated behind its public facade. What he discovered was both fascinating and horrifying. Hansung Group was indeed involved in numerous ongoing legal disputes, from environmental violations to labor law infractions to breach of contract claims. They had a pattern of cutting corners, breaking promises, and using their legal team to intimidate opponents into settling for less than they deserved. The Uedo Heights building that Sang-ho had mentioned was just one of several properties with documented structural problems that Hansung had chosen to cover up rather than fix. There were internal memos discussing how much it would cost to retrofit the buildings versus how much they were likely to pay in eventual lawsuits, with the cold calculation that lawsuits were cheaper. There were also documents related to Seo-jin personally, trust fund paperwork, prenuptial agreement drafts for her engagement to Park Hyun-woo, and correspondence about her behavioral issues during her university years. Junho learned that her family had hired private investigators to monitor her activities. Concerned that she was associating with inappropriate individuals and engaging in conduct unbecoming of her station, the private investigators had taken photos of Seo-jin with Junho. Photos of them walking together, eating together, kissing goodbye outside his apartment building. The reports described Junho as a low-class construction worker with no apparent prospects and recommended that the family take immediate action to terminate this association before it becomes publicly known. Junho stared at the surveillance photos for a long time, trying to process the implications. So Jin's family had known about their relationship for months, maybe even years. They had been watching, evaluating, planning their intervention. The engagement announcement hadn't been a coincidence or a response to family pressure. It had been a carefully orchestrated move to separate Seo-jin from the man they considered a threat to their reputation. But what struck him most was the realization that Seo-jin must have known about the surveillance. There were emails between her and her father discussing the situation with her inappropriate companion. She had been planning her exit strategy even while she was telling Junho that she loved him, even while she was taking his money for her mother's fictional medical crisis. The depth of her betrayal was breathtaking. It hadn't just been a lie. It had been a coordinated deception involving her entire family, private investigators, and corporate lawyers. Junho had been nothing more than a problem to be managed and eliminated. That night, Junho sat in his apartment with the Hansung files spread across his small table. He now had access to information that could destroy the company, evidence of safety violations, environmental crimes, tax evasion, and a dozen other illegal activities. But he also understood that having the information and being able to use it effectively were two different things. If he went to the authorities with what he had discovered, Hansung's lawyers would claim that the documents were stolen, that Junho had violated attorney-client privilege, that anything he had found was inadmissible. They would destroy his credibility and probably have him arrested for corporate espionage. If he went to the media, the same problems would apply. No reputable journalist would publish a story based on illegally obtained documents from a disgruntled ex-boyfriend with an obvious motive for revenge. He needed a different approach, something that would force the truth into the open without making him the obvious source. He needed to be smarter, more subtle, more patient than he had originally planned. Junho began to study the patterns in Hansung's legal troubles. Most of their problems came from the same fundamental issue. They prioritized profit over everything else, including safety, legality, and basic human decency. This created a constant stream of violations and lawsuits that their legal team spent enormous amounts of time and money managing. But legal teams, Junho realized, were not infallible. They made mistakes, missed deadlines, failed to file important documents on time, and when they did, the consequences could be catastrophic for their clients. Over the next several months, Junho began to make small, subtle mistakes in his document management. Nothing that would obviously point to sabotage, but enough to create problems. A filing deadline missed here, a document misfiled there, a database entry that was just slightly incorrect. Each mistake was carefully calculated to cause maximum disruption while maintaining plausible deniability. Junho was just a part-time employee learning the ropes, after all. Everyone expected him to make some errors while he was getting up to speed. The cumulative effect was more significant than Junho had dared to hope. Hansung Group found themselves facing increased scrutiny from regulators who were no longer receiving timely responses to their inquiries. Court cases that should have been settled quietly were instead becoming public spectacles when important documents failed to materialize. Financial reports that should have painted a rosy picture of the company's health were instead raising questions about irregular accounting practices. The pressure was beginning to show in the documents that crossed Junho's desk. Memos between executives were becoming more frantic, more desperate. emergency meetings were being called to address recent operational challenges. The legal fees for managing the company's various crises were skyrocketing. But Junho's most important discovery came 6 months into his employment at Kim Associates. While organizing files related to a regulatory investigation into Hansung's construction practices, he found a memo from Lee Dong-suk, Sojin's father, to the company's chief financial officer. The memo discussed a special fund that had been established to handle sensitive situations that could affect the company's reputation. The fund, which contained over 10 billion won, was used to pay bribes to government officials, silence whistleblowers, and cover up safety violations. The memo specifically mentioned payments to building inspectors who had overlooked structural problems in Hansung construction projects, including Uido Heights. This was it, the smoking gun that could bring down the entire Lee family empire. But Junho still needed to find a way to get the information to someone who could act on it without implicating himself as the source. The solution came from an unexpected direction. One of Junho's co-workers at the construction site, a young man named Kim Tae-ho, mentioned that his girlfriend worked as a junior reporter for a business news website. She was always looking for story leads, especially anything related to corporate corruption or safety violations. "She's really good at her job," Tae-ho said proudly. "She's broken several big stories about companies trying to cover up problems. She knows how to protect her sources too." Junho began to plan his approach carefully. He couldn't just hand over the documents. That would be too obvious and too risky. But he could create a situation where the reporter would be led to discover the information through her own investigation. He started by anonymously sending the reporter small pieces of information about Hansung Group's construction practices. Not enough to break a story, but enough to pique her interest and get her asking questions. He sent her the address of the Uido Heights building and a vague tip about structural problems. He sent her the names of inspectors who had been involved in approving questionable building permits. The reporter, whose name was Jung Soo-young, began to investigate. Junho watched from a distance as her inquiries started to create ripples throughout the system. Building inspectors were suddenly being asked to justify their decisions. Regulatory officials were reviewing files that had been gathering dust for years. As the pressure mounted, Hansung Group's legal team began to make mistakes. Real mistakes this time. Not the subtle sabotage that Junho had been orchestrating. They missed deadlines because they were overwhelmed. They failed to properly vet documents before filing them, leading to contradictions that sharp-eyed investigators were quick to notice. The first major story broke on a Tuesday morning in October, almost exactly 1 year after Sojin's engagement announcement. Jung Soo-young published an investigative piece titled "Luxury Buildings, Deadly Secrets: How Hansung Group Puts Profits Before Safety." The article detailed structural problems in multiple Hansung construction projects and included testimony from construction workers who had been pressured to remain silent about safety violations. Junho read the article on his phone during his lunch break, his heart pounding with a mixture of excitement and fear. It was really happening. The empire that had treated him like an insect was finally beginning to crumble. But this was just the beginning. Over the following weeks, Jung Soo-young published follow-up articles that dug deeper into Hansung Group's business practices. Other reporters began to pick up the story, and soon Seoul's major newspapers were running their own investigations into the company's activities. The scandal reached its peak when Jung Soo-young somehow obtained documents proving the existence of the special fund that Lee Dong-suk had used to pay bribes. Junho had no idea how she had gotten the information. His sabotage had created chaos, but he hadn't directly leaked the most damaging documents. Perhaps one of Hansung's many enemies had taken advantage of the company's weakened state to deliver the final blow. The government launched a formal investigation into Hansung Group's business practices. Stock prices plummeted. Construction projects were halted pending safety inspections. Lee Dong-suk was called to testify before a parliamentary committee about his company's activities. And through it all, Junho continued to work his 2 jobs, watching the destruction unfold with quiet satisfaction. No one suspected that the part-time document clerk and full-time construction worker had played any role in bringing down one of South Korea's most powerful corporations. The personal cost to the Lee family was everything Junho had hoped for and more. So-jin's engagement to Park Hyun-woo was quietly called off as the Park family distanced themselves from the scandal. The charitable foundations that bore the Lee family name were forced to close as donors withdrew their support. Properties that had been in the family for generations were sold to pay legal fees and settlement costs. So-jin herself became a virtual prisoner in her family's remaining assets, hounded by reporters whenever she appeared in public. Her social media accounts went silent. The carefully curated image of the sophisticated heiress was replaced by grainy paparazzi photos of a woman who looked haunted and exhausted. Junho felt no pity for her. She had made her choice 2 years ago when she decided that her comfort was more important than his heart. Now she was learning what it felt like to watch your world collapse around you, to realize that everything you had taken for granted could disappear in an instant. But the most satisfying moment came 6 months after the scandal broke, when Junho was working late at Kim Associates and received an unexpected visitor. The receptionist called to inform him that someone was asking to speak with him, a young woman who claimed it was urgent. He found So-jin waiting in the lobby, and for a moment he almost didn't recognize her. Gone was the polished heiress from the society magazines. Her hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail. Her clothes were modest and unremarkable, and she looked like she had lost weight. She looked, in fact, very much like the girl he had thought he was in love with 2 years ago. "Hello, Junho," she said quietly. "So-jin." He kept his voice neutral, professional. "What are you doing here? I wanted to talk to you. I've been trying to reach you for months, but you changed your number." "I had to. Too many reporters were calling after your family's problems became public." It wasn't entirely a lie. There had been some calls from journalists looking for anyone who had known the Lee family personally. "Our family's problems," she repeated with a bitter laugh. "Is that what they're calling it?" Junho studied her face, looking for any sign of the manipulation and deception he had once been blind to. But she just looked tired and sad, like someone who had aged years in a matter of months. "Why are you here?" he asked. "Because I know it was you," she said simply. Junho's blood turned to ice, but he kept his expression calm. "I don't know what you mean. The investigation into our company, the leaked documents, the reporters asking exactly the right questions. It's too convenient to be coincidence. Someone with inside knowledge orchestrated this whole thing, and the only person who had both the motive and the opportunity was you." "That's quite an accusation," Junho said carefully. "Do you have any proof?" Jin shook her head. "No proof, no evidence, nothing that would hold up in court or even convince anyone else. But I know it was you, because I know how smart you are, and I know how much I hurt you." Junho remained silent, waiting. "I deserve everything that's happened to my family," she continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "I lied to you. I used you. I threw away something real for something hollow. But my father, my mother, they're innocent of what happened between us. They were just trying to protect their daughter from what they saw as a mistake." "Were they innocent when they hired private investigators to spy on us?" Junho asked quietly. "Were they innocent when they decided that my feelings didn't matter because I wasn't wealthy enough to be worthy of consideration?" So Jin's face crumpled. "You found the surveillance reports. I found a lot of things. Your family's empire was built on corruption, safety violations, and the exploitation of people like me. If it's crumbling now, it's because it deserved to crumble." "Maybe," she said, tears finally spilling down her cheeks. "But did my mother deserve to have a heart attack from the stress? Did my father deserve to be humiliated in front of the entire country? Did I deserve to lose everything I ever cared about?" Junho looked at her for a long moment, and for the first time in over a year, he felt something other than cold satisfaction. Not forgiveness. He wasn't ready for that, might never be ready for that, but perhaps a small measure of pity. "Yes," he said finally, "you did. Because you never cared about me enough to be honest. You cared about the fantasy of being with me. But when it came time to choose between your comfortable lie and an uncomfortable truth, you chose the lie. Every single time. I was young and scared and stupid, she protested. So was I. But I never lied to you. I gave you everything I had. My heart, my trust, my savings, my dreams of our future together. I worked myself to exhaustion trying to provide for you because I thought you needed me. And you let me, knowing it was all built on a foundation of deception. So Jin wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. What do you want from me? An apology? I'm sorry. I'm sorrier than you'll ever know. Revenge? You've got it. My family is ruined, my reputation is destroyed, and everyone I thought cared about me has abandoned me. What more do you want? Junho considered her question seriously. What did he want? For months, his entire existence had been focused on bringing down the Lee family empire, on making Sojin understand what it felt like to lose everything. He had succeeded beyond his wildest dreams. So why didn't he feel satisfied? I want you to understand, he said finally, that actions have consequences. That you can't treat people's hearts like toys and expect to get away with it forever. That love, real love, requires courage, and you were too much of a coward to choose it when it mattered. I understand now, she said quietly. But understanding doesn't change anything, does it? It doesn't bring back what we had, and it doesn't undo the damage we've both caused. No, Junho agreed. It doesn't. They stood in silence for a moment. Two people who had once shared everything, now separated by an ocean of hurt and betrayal. I should go, so, Jin said finally. I wanted you to know that I know. And I wanted to tell you that despite everything, despite all the lies and the pain and the destruction, what I felt for you was real. Maybe it wasn't enough. Maybe it wasn't the kind of love you deserved, but it was real. She turned to leave, then paused and looked back at him one last time. For what it's worth, I hope you find someone who loves you the way you deserve to be loved. Someone who's brave enough to choose you, completely and honestly, even when it's difficult. After she left, Junho remained in the lobby for a long time, staring out at the city lights and trying to process what had just happened. He had expected to feel triumphant, vindicated, complete. Instead, he felt hollow. He had gotten his revenge, but at what cost? The woman he had once loved was broken, her family was destroyed, and hundreds of innocent employees had lost their jobs when Hansung Group collapsed. The construction workers who had built their empire were now unemployed, struggling to feed their families, while the executives who had exploited them fled to private estates overseas. And Junho himself? He had become someone he didn't recognize, calculating, manipulative, consumed by a desire for retribution that had taken over his entire life. He had spent over a year focused on destroying the past, instead of building a future. That night, Junho made a decision. He submitted his resignation from Kim Associates, effective immediately. He also made an anonymous phone call to Young Soo Young, the reporter, providing her with information about several other construction companies that were engaged in the same kinds of safety violations and corruption that had brought down Hansung Group. If he had learned anything from his revenge against Sojin's family, it was that the system itself was broken, not just one company within it. Then he packed his belongings and left Seoul. He used the money he had saved from his 2 jobs to enroll in a university in Busan, where he studied structural engineering with a focus on building safety. His goal was no longer destruction but construction. He wanted to build things that would last, that would protect people instead of endangering them. It took him 3 years to complete his degree, working part-time to support himself and studying with the same intensity he had once devoted to planning revenge. When he graduated at the top of his class, he was offered a position with a firm that specialized in retrofitting older buildings to meet modern safety standards. His first major project was in Seoul, an apartment complex that had been built in the 1990s with substandard materials and needed extensive renovation to be safe for its residents. As he reviewed the building's original blueprints and structural assessments, Junho realized with dark irony that it was one of the Hansung Group properties that had been abandoned when the company collapsed. The residents were mostly working-class families who couldn't afford to move elsewhere, trapped in homes that were slowly deteriorating around them. They reminded Junho of himself, people who deserved better but had been forgotten by those with the power to help them. He threw himself into the project with passionate dedication, working 18-hour days to ensure that every aspect of the renovation met the highest safety standards. He insisted on using the best materials, even when it meant reducing the profit margin. He personally inspected every beam, every foundation support, every structural element. When the project was completed 6 months later, Junho felt a satisfaction deeper than anything his revenge against Sojin had provided. He had created something valuable, something that would protect people for decades to come. He had taken his pain and anger and transformed them into something constructive. 5 years after leaving Seoul, Junho had established his own engineering firm specializing in building safety and renovation. His company was small but respected, known for its integrity and its refusal to cut corners for the sake of profit. He employed a dozen engineers and safety inspectors, many of them former construction workers who had been retrained in modern building techniques. He never married, though he dated occasionally. He found it difficult to trust completely, to open his heart the way he once had with Sojin. But he was content with his life, satisfied with the work he was doing and the difference he was making. One autumn day, while reviewing plans for a new school renovation project, Junho received an unexpected phone call from his sister Minji. "Oppa," she said, her voice excited. "You'll never guess who I ran into at the grocery store yesterday." "Who?" "Lee So-jin. Remember her? Your girlfriend from university?" Junho's hand tightened on the phone. He hadn't heard So-jin's name spoken aloud in years, though he occasionally saw mentions of the Lee family in business news articles about the ongoing legal proceedings related to Hansung Group's collapse. "What did she say?" he asked carefully. "She asked about you, actually. She looks different. Older, I guess, but also somehow more. I don't know how to describe it. More real? She was dressed simply, no makeup, working as a cashier at the store. Can you believe that? Lee So-jin, working retail?" Junho could believe it. The Lee family's assets had been frozen or liquidated to pay legal settlements and fines. So-jin would have had to find work like anyone else, probably for the first time in her life. "She seemed genuinely interested in how you were doing," Minji continued. "She said she was glad to hear that you were successful and happy. She seemed, I don't know, relieved? Like she had been worried about you. Did she say anything else?" "She asked me to give you a message if I ever talked to you. She said to tell you that she's learned the difference between loving someone and loving the idea of someone, and that she hopes you've found both." Junho sat quietly for a moment, processing this information. "Oppa? Are you still there?" "I'm here," he said. "Thank you for telling me." That evening, Junho drove to Seoul for the first time in 5 years. He found the grocery store where Minji had encountered Sojin and parked across the street, watching through the large windows as she worked the evening shift. She looked exactly as Minji had described. Older, simpler, more authentic somehow. The artifice that had once defined her was completely gone. He sat in his car for over an hour, debating whether to go inside. What would he say to her? What was the point of reopening old wounds that had finally begun to heal? In the end, he drove away without speaking to her. Some chapters in life needed to remain closed, no matter how much curiosity or lingering emotion might urge you to reopen them. But as he drove back to Busan, Junho found himself thinking about forgiveness. Not the kind that meant forgetting or excusing what had happened, but the kind that meant releasing the poison of resentment that had consumed so much of his life. Sojin had paid for her deceptions in ways that probably exceeded even what his desire for revenge had demanded. Her family's empire was gone, her privileged life was over, and she was finally learning what it meant to work for survival. More importantly, Junho realized that he had built something better than revenge. He had built a life of purpose, a career that helped people, a future that didn't depend on the destruction of others. The boy who had once loved Lee So-jin was gone, replaced by a man who had learned that the best response to betrayal wasn't more betrayal, but the patient construction of something better. 6 months later, Junho received a letter with no return address. Inside was a newspaper clipping about his engineering firm's latest project, a low-income housing renovation that had been featured in a Seoul architecture magazine. Attached to the clipping was a handwritten note in familiar handwriting. "I saw this article and wanted you to know how proud I am of what you've accomplished. You're building the kind of future I was too scared to choose when it mattered. I hope you're happy, Junho. You deserve all the happiness in the world." Junho read the note twice, then filed it away in his desk drawer. It wasn't forgiveness exactly, and it wasn't reconciliation. But it was acknowledgement of the past, of the pain they had caused each other, and of the different paths they had chosen to heal from it. That night, for the first time in years, Junho allowed himself to remember the good moments from his relationship with Sojin. Not the lies or the betrayal or the devastating discovery of her deception, but the quiet evenings they had spent together, the laughter they had shared, the dreams they had built before everything fell apart. Those memories belonged to a different person, both a different version of him and a different version of her, but they had been real in their own way. The next morning, Junho woke up and went to work on his latest project, a hospital renovation that would ensure the safety of thousands of patients and medical staff for generations to come. It was the kind of work that mattered, the kind of legacy worth building. He never wrote back to Sojin, and he never saw her again. But sometimes, when he was reviewing blueprints late at night or inspecting a newly reinforced foundation, he would think about the twisted path that had led him from heartbreak to purpose. He had set out to destroy the woman who had betrayed him, and in the process, he had discovered who he was meant to become. Revenge, he had learned, was a fire that consumed everything it touched, including the person who carried it. But forgiveness, true forgiveness, was something else entirely. It wasn't about excusing the past or pretending it hadn't happened. It was about choosing to build a future that wasn't defined by the wounds others had inflicted. In the end, that was the greatest victory of all, not the destruction of his enemies, but the construction of a life worth living, brick by brick, beam by beam, with the patient skill of someone who understood that the strongest foundations were built not on anger, but on hope.